It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the Heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. You know, one of the great things about podcasts is that they're great to listen to on bike rides. As a matter of fact, my homepage, the website, podcastbygeorge.com, we talk about the fact that you might want to download them and listen to them on your bike. And that's what I was doing this morning. I was riding along on the bike trail listening to a podcast by Jimmy Dore and really enjoying it. And I had to beat it home to get back on the phone here to do an interview on the Podcast by George live line with Marianne Wesley Fowler. She's the Senior Strategist for Policy Advocacy for the Rails to Trails Conservancy. So all you bike riders out there, all you folks that listen to podcasts, listen in because this is very interesting. It caught my eye. I saw an article on it. This is a great organization. Marianne can fill us in a little bit about their work, but I'm particularly interested in this Rails to Trails Conservancy and the fact that I ride an abandoned rail trail. Mostly, that's what I ride for the bike, and they're going to knit this stuff together, and we're going to get a nationwide bike trail of some type. But anyway, let's welcome in Marianne. Say good morning. And Marianne, are you in Washington? It comes up as like a Washington area code. Is that where you folks are located?
Well, our central office is in Washington, D.C., but we have offices in the Northeast, the Midwest, the West, the South.
Yeah.
So we have a presence all over the country.
Well, give us a quick thumbnail, some background now on the organization. What is it that you're up to?
Well, Rails to Trails Conservancy, I guess we're 33 years old now, and
Wow.
we were founded by a group of advocates in response to the Congress's deregulation of the railroad industry, which led to the thousands of miles of rail corridor being slashed from active inventory, and people all over the country saying, wow, we're going to lose our train service. That's not good, but this corridor could make a great trail. But the know-how of how to go through that conversion process and plan and design and operate, maintain, what have you, a rail trail was pretty complicated, particularly since all the rail corridors were still under federal regulatory authority. So RTC was formed to help communities go through that process of converting a active rail corridor that was been put up for abandonment by the railroads into a trail to serve the needs of their community. Now, since then, I have to say, as we got more and more rail trails on the ground and people were using rail trails, and we had initially thought that the use of rail trails would be recreational, certainly primarily recreational, but once you open a rail trail, it becomes the province of the people who use it, and other people who were using had sometimes different ideas, particularly using those trails for transportation. And so the rail trail didn't necessarily always take them from where they were to where they wanted to go. So somewhere about the middle of our lifespan as an organization, we expanded our mission to include rail trails and connecting trails, and now are very much into building trail systems and networks where that makes sense, where there's a contiguous population, so the network is beneficial for both recreation and transportation, and then spines of trails that connect community to community, so more the long distance trails. So we do both, and we're it's just really very gratifying and brings such a wonderful dimension, quality of life-wise, to our every community. It has them in every country, across the country.
It's a fantastic thing. I can attest to that. I'm kind of flashing back to 20 years ago. I was riding my bike, and, I'm out on the roads. I don't like that, and I sure don't like being out on the highways. It's dangerous. I say, well, I'll ride the country roads. I go out on the gravel. Some people do that today still. Well, the dogs, that's what I remember, is being attacked by the guard dogs of these farmsteads on these gravel roads. And I mean, they won't give up, and you better be able to motor. That's what I remember about riding the gravel roads. The ride itself was kind of pleasant, a little dusty, but my God, the dogs would about eat you alive. So we had kind of what you're talking about here.
Well, I have to tell you, George, the reason I laugh is because my sister's dog, Bosco, because I originate from a farm in East Tennessee,
Yeah.
and my sister's dog Bosco went out after a bicyclist and bit him on the calf, and the dog had poor cyclist, and then of course the dog had to be sent to the vet to go under observation for the requisite length of time, et cetera, et cetera. It was pretty awful. But in the country, we don't chain our outside dogs up. It's
Right.
not.
And they don't like bicyclists, and maybe I get that. So I went through that drill, and then a wonderful thing happened. There's a 11-mile rail line between these two communities. They pulled up the track. And I was, I might have been one of the very first people to ever use it. I put my bike on the cinder bed and rode on it before they had done anything with it. They had pulled up the rails. They hadn't put in bridges yet or reconstructed them. So I portaged across the creek beds and rode it that way. But still, it was a very nice ride just on the cinder bed before they did the work. Well, then eventually... it was blacktopped, and it's a great ride. And the thing about the rail lines that's wonderful, and I know Mary Ann's aware of this. The rail grade is such that there aren't a lot of steep hills, and it's straight, and some of it's in tree canopy, and some of it's out in the open. So you get a little bit of both experiences, and it's just a wonderful thing. Now that's all good. The bad thing is, it really is kind of a bike trail to nowhere. I mean, that's pretty much it. If you want to go on either side of the communities, you're going to be out on the roads again, or riding like I talked about earlier. So would this be Mary Ann, is this what you would call a spine route? Is that what you call it? Or what would you call it, a 11-mile route like that between two communities, but not connected to anything?
That's what I was referenced before, which is that every rail trail does not take you from where you are to where you want to go, and that's how we get into building systems. But that doesn't mean that every single rail trail that's been converted into a trail is, as of yet, connected to a more major system. That's probably a goal for the future, and that's, it's happening more and more.
And there is some talk about connecting these trails in cities east to west across the entire United States. Is that getting any closer to a reality, or is that something that's still just on a planner's drawing board?
Oh, no. This is our a flagship project as Rails to Trails Conservancy. Almost from the time we were founded, we could tell that there was an alignment. Of course, there would be. I mean, that we had coast-to-coast railroads. Only one of which, though, has ever been abandoned, but that there was an alignment forming across the country, and we always wanted to have a coast-to-coast trail. It's just such a wonderful vision and would be so great to ride. And but we decided as an organization that it wasn't something we could really take on until it was further along. Number one, our purpose was to help every community everywhere convert their derelict rail corridor into a trail. And number two, there had to be some reality, some feasibility to making this happen. So what we kind of decided was that if it ever got to the point where it was over halfway done, just sort of on its own, without our being a guiding hand behind it, that then we would take it on as a project. And we reached that tipping point a couple of years ago, and we then proceeded to do a feasibility study on the likelihood and how we could connect this up to go across the country. What route could we develop? And we decided it was definitely doable. It was a go, and we announced the preferred route on May 8th. We go coast to coast from Washington, D.C. to Washington State with 12 states in between. And it's really very, very exciting.
So what's the timetable for, if you try to ride that right now, you're going to be on areas that are open road and not bike trail, correct? I mean, there's no knitting yet. Okay,
there are 130 open trails that we call hosting trails that are in the route of the Great American Rail Trail. So, and a lot of them do connect, but a lot of them don't. And the route, the entire route is now composed of open trails, planned trails. And by planned trails, we mean trails that are in a master trail plan of a community or a state that have been approved and will happen. And then we have another category of gaps. And so we have a number of gaps along this trail, and we get more gaps the further west we get until we hit Idaho. But we have gaps. Most of the gaps are between the middle of Nebraska and the Idaho-Montana border. But right now, you could start in Washington, D.C. and get all the way to Pittsburgh.
Wow. Well, give us kind of in the world of radio here, we talk about a word picture. And what I'm thinking of, our most immediate experience with this type of thing is RAGBRAI here in the state of Iowa, which perhaps you've heard of. It's the Des Moines Register's annual Great Bike Ride across Iowa. People take a week off for that, and in a week they can dip a tire in the Mississippi River and put it in the Missouri, or vice versa, I guess, maybe depending on how they're running the route, and traverse the entire state. Let's say you wanted to take a week off, or maybe you wanted to take a 2-week vacation on the Great American Rail Trail. Describe that for us. Again, kind of a word picture for us. How would you see that happening for a bicyclist? Would this be primarily a camping experience?
Well, it depends on where you would be in the country. Now, 2 weeks. Now, are we on a family trip? Do we have kids with us, or are we
that makes a difference, doesn't it?
Super experienced cyclist?
Yeah.
Sure does.
Yeah.
Sure does. But say for example, you were going to tackle the West End. You wanted to get to Seattle and then get to Cedar Falls, Washington, and hop on the Palouse Cascades Trail. And you could go all the way across the state of Washington to the Idaho border, with a few gaps in between, but 3 of those gaps, funding for filling 3 of those gaps was approved in the state legislature 2 or 3 weeks ago. But there are reroutes around those gaps currently. But say you're doing this, 3 years from now, and they have filled those gaps. 2 weeks you would start and go through the wonderful Palouse Cascades, or the tunnel that goes through the Cascade Mountains, the longest tunnel. It's over a mile long, and then you'd come out on the eastern side of the Cascades and then down the side of the Cascades into a completely different type of climate and topography. You'd be what they call scrublands. And there, not too long after that, in front of you would be the slashing Columbia River. And one of the items that was approved in the Washington budget was the rehab of that bridge across the Columbia River. It's been there just waiting to be rehabbed. It was abandoned in 1980 when the old Milwaukee Road went under. But you would cross that iconic bridge, and then you'd be on your way across the scrublands. And the scrublands were left from debris from when the glaciers receded. And it's pretty wild. But there are a number of small towns along there, and depending upon whether you're with the family or whether you're the super efficient cyclist, you might go 30 miles a day or 60 miles a day. And when you said earlier how the rail trails have fairly gentle gradients, and that's because the ability of old trains to pull steep hills they just didn't have the technology and the ability to do that, and so they had to have stations, along the way to fill them back up with water and with fuel and what have you. And those stations created little towns. And so those are the little towns where you would find a place to eat, a place to spend the night, a place to enjoy some of the other views and topographies and what have you, museums, railroad history, American history, separate from the railroad. So it's part of your trip. The quality of your trip would depend upon whether your purpose was to get from point A to point B, or whether you wanted to learn about and experience the countryside through which you were traveling. But on you'd go across Washington, and then you'd hit the Palouse part of Washington, which I never even knew existed. Palouse is these wonderful rolling hills. I've never seen anything like it. They just roll and make, on top of each other, on and on and on into the horizon. But there's some great slashes where rivers came through there, and so you have these trestles going over through these hills, and before you know it, you'd be almost to the Idaho border. But before you got there, you'd cross the Tico Trestle. You'd be way up over this deep, deep gorge on this trestle, and that's another piece that's was in the Washington budget, is to rehab the Tico Trestle. And you'd spend the night in Tico and decide whether you were going to go home or whether you were going to continue into Idaho the next day.
Ah, God, that sounds great. I mean, I love RAGBRAI, and I love my native state of Iowa, but I got to tell you, a lot of Iowa's vistas are not that inspiring, and the summers can be kind of hot and buggy, and I don't know, that just sounds fantastic. Now, they've had budget approval. That's happening up there. It's a reality. It'll take some time. When do you think that'll actually be able to, you can bike that as you've described it? How long will that take, do you think?
Well, see, actually, you can bike that now by doing reroutes around those parts that they approved the rehab for.
Oh, like that bridge that's out.
But it's going to be much better, much better. Not to have to reroute around the Beverly Bridge. I mean, right now you have to go about 130 miles on roads to do that, or risk your life going across the interstate bridge. But I think. I really don't know how long it takes to rehab a bridge. Maybe 2 or 3 years, probably no more than that. I mean, the bridge is in awfully good shape, actually, and part of it's because in any place where you don't have a lot of rain, things don't deteriorate badly, and they don't have a lot of rain in that part of Washington State because we're on the eastern side of the Cascades where they have a whole lot of rain. But once you get on that eastern side, then it's not so much moisture, and so things don't deteriorate as quickly. And so the bridge is really in great shape, as is the Tico Trestle.
I mean, that's inspiring. That's great. Just to hear you describe it is just wonderful, yeah. It makes me think of my childhood with listening to or reading Steinbeck's novel Travels with Charlie. It was all about a trek across the United States. His favorite part of the country was the country that you're talking about up there in Washington, Idaho, and even Montana. That's what Steinbeck thought was the crown jewel, part of the country. So I that just sounds wonderful.
Well, the topographies are extraordinary. I mean, but I mean, it's not like the East and the Midwest aren't wonderful too, and that is the incredibly special thing about the Great American Rail Trail, is that depending upon where it is, it will acquaint you or reacquaint you with particular parts of our country. We have a very diverse country, and usually we think of diversity in terms of people, but we have a very diverse country geographically, topographically. As well as culturally. And riding the Great American Rail Trail will bring you in contact with all sorts of different experiences, both with people, with cultures, with history, with urban America, with rural America, with wild landscape America. I mean, some of the parts in Wyoming are just astounding. I mean, it's all rock.
Yeah.
But every 30 miles, there's a little town that was the railroad town, or still is the railroad town. So we have this incredible legacy from the 19th century and 20th century of this rail system that, for whatever reasons, it was decided would no longer be needed for rail service. Some question that decision, but that was the decision that was made. And we have inherited that. And it's ours to make the most of it and to turn it to this great American experience.
Well, as you head west, I mean, if you go through the Heartland and go up into those areas that you're talking about, you're kind of like Lewis and Clark on a bicycle. I mean, this topography change, this diversity of the nation that you're talking about, the physical characteristics that they first saw for the very first time as the explorers, you'll be able to see from the seat of a bicycle. It just sounds fantastic. What about, I kind of subtitled this podcast as, a real world look at things from the Heartland. So we kind of tend to focus on our central part of the United States here. Can you describe about that as you would move across the Heartland? How would you describe the trail through here.
Are you thinking of Iowa as the heartland?
Yeah, it kind of depends. If you're from Illinois, people say Illinois, and I suppose in Nebraska they think the same thing. But yeah, I mean, any of those states that are in this midsection of the country.
Well, okay, in Illinois, one of the part of the route will be hosted by the Hennepin Canal. Now, some people say, how can you say Great American Rail Trail when some of it's on canal towpath? And that's because we can. I mean, why would we not use an absolutely wonderful trail that is exactly aligned between where we are and where we want to go? And also because it brings the user in contact with another form of, we'll call it antique transportation. But the Hennepin Canal in western Illinois was just about the last major canal built in the United States. It was built just after the turn of the century into the 1900s, and it's when they thought that canals were, the answer to transportation, and it was the state of the art, very, very modern canal, and I think it's 90 some odd miles long. We might need to fact check that, but just as they got it finished, the railroads kind of took over. And so it was never really used that much as a canal in terms of carrying, marketing traffic. But one of the major roles that it played was that because it was so advanced in its canal building skills and what have you, that the men who worked and built that canal, actually that's where they got their training to subsequently build the Panama Canal. And so that's the part of the history of that part of the heartland, the contribution the heartland made to other objectives of the country.
Okay, well, that sounds like a day trip, maybe on a bike if you're a hardcore
could
bicyclist.
Be a day trip for a super rider like you, George.
Yeah.
I think so. For me, not so much.
Not so much, yeah.
But we cross out of Iowa into Nebraska. From Omaha, we dip down to Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And then from Lincoln, we had sort of a northwesterly tangent until we get to Norfolk, Nebraska, and the Cowboy Trail. And the Cowboy Trail is one of the longest trails that we have in the country. And there's a lot of corn along the Cowboy Trail, no question about it. But there are also these magnificent sand dunes. But the thing about that part of the country that fascinates me the most is that really is this sort of transition from a green America to a much drier America, where you have to have irrigation. And you see it from the airplane if you're flying across the country. You look out the window and you see where the whirlies start, the circles, irrigation. Well, that trail takes you through that transition. Absolutely fascinating.
They've had some flooding out in some parts of that. I got to ask you a question now, just based on what you're describing there. If you are south of Des Moines, there's a town called Osceola. Now, you go Osceola from central Iowa to Omaha, and then you go Omaha to Lincoln, as you're describing. You're kind of paralleling Amtrak, the current train track that's there. It's the only one, really, that'll take you west on Amtrak. Is this this rail system, how does it parallel Amtrak? How does that work? Is that an older system that's not being used any longer, or
Yes, and we haven't got Nebraska is one of those states where we have some gaps, and so we don't have every detail of the route worked out. But there are some places, I'm not saying that that's one of them, where we'll want to be doing rail with trail.
Oh.
So that we'll be sharing the corridor with trains, and that's part of our challenge is getting the railroads companies to agree to that. Now we have rail with trail, trails in every state in the country, but every single one was very hard fought, and very usually the railroads have been resistive. But once they're in there and they're working really well, then they kind of get mollified, but the railroads have their great concern over safety as well as they should. But there's actually a study just being finished by the Federal Highway Administration with Rails with Trails with a subcontractor on it, on rails with trails in the country, and the facilities are incredibly safe. I mean, they're far safer to have people in a rail corridor on a trail, a designated place to be, than just have people kind of willy-nilly going in the rail corridor, which people will do, and trespass in an unsafe, usually using the tracks, and that's where the lack of safety comes in. But that's a part of what we'll be working with as we go across the country, a few of the places where we need to combine with railroads.
Well, and the combination makes perfect sense. As an example, you could ride the bike trail. You could go from Des Moines, Central Iowa here to Omaha or Lincoln, put your bike on the train, which I would assume you could do now, and you could get on the California Zephyr and go over the mountains and into San Francisco. And when you get there, you've got your transportation. You got your bike right with you on the train. Now, that sounds kind of like a cool way to get around, and you don't have to go grab a rental car. You can ride your bike to where you want to go.
I think that's your dream come true, George.
Yeah, that sounds great.
See, the thing is, it all needs to be interconnected. These should not be separate systems.
Right. Yeah. And this interwoven, this seamless trail for bicyclists is just like it is a dream come true. It's a great thing here for people to get involved in or to follow. What do you recommend people here now that want to follow along, be a part of this, maybe want to get involved with your organization as we get ready to wrap up our podcast here? What do you suggest to folks that are of that mind? Because bicycles are kind of DIYers, they kind of like to jump into this stuff.
Okay, well, first of all, if you want to use parts of the Great American Rail Trail that are currently open, you can go to Rails to Trails Conservancy's website, railstotrails.org, as our organization. And we have a map finder part of that. It's called traillink.com. And you can find parts of the trail that are open and usable now. If you want to become involved in helping to build the trail in your state, then probably the best point of contact for each state, either through us, could contact us, and we could customize where you live and where we could fit you in and that kind of thing. Or if you just want to call your state trail administrator, because every state trail administrator all along the route. Oh, maybe I should say the route. The route is Washington, D.C., to Maryland, to Pennsylvania, to West Virginia, to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Washington State. So all the state trail administrators all along the route are involved in working on the Great American Rail Trail in their state, and so they'll know how to guide you for state by state.
God, that's great. I mean, I'm ready. I want to go. Let's hop on the bike and take a ride. That sounds fantastic.
Now, wait a minute, George. Do you want to ride the trail, or you want to help make the trail?
Yeah, probably. I'm going to be your biggest fan and promoter here with the podcast, and probably just a rider and watching the thing evolve out. Now, I'm going to put the links that you mentioned on the web pages and on the Facebook pages so people can get to you and become a part of this and suggest that they do that. But
George, promoting the trail is also building the trail.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Promoting the trail is building the trail.
Well, that's what we're going to do. Well, I've really enjoyed this, and just the word picture that we talked about, the visual, I just kind of felt like I was along for the ride today. Anything in closing here that I didn't ask about that you always like to emphasize or make sure that people are aware of that I didn't ask about here before we close out?
Well, just that there's a sort of metaphorical rebinding and reconnecting the country going on here, too. I think we all feel that our country is splintered, and that we need to have more familiarity with it and its various parts and its various people. And I do see this trail reconnecting our country, reconnecting our people. We need to know each other better. We need to know our country and understand our country better. And I think this trail will help us accomplish that.
My God, that's a great, I never thought of that. That's a great way to close this. That's exactly right. And we talk about that on the podcast every once in a while, kind of this digital world that we've living in that allows people just to sit around and watch their TV channel and maybe even just listen to their favorite podcast or whatever. People are not getting out. They're not meeting and greeting and getting to know other people. in our own nation and around the world. So this is an opportunity to get that community going and get people back together and get pulling on the rope together as Americans. That's a great thing. I'm glad you mentioned that, and I wouldn't have thought of it otherwise. But that's the beauty of these interviews. Well, joining us today on the podcast, Marianne Wesley Fowler. She's the Senior Strategist for Policy Advocacy with the Rails to Trails Conservancy. And as I mentioned, look for those links, contact them, follow along, watch this thing grow, and get out there and be a part of it. And for right now, we'll just encourage everybody to listen to our podcast, of course, on YouTube and Facebook, and you can check us out on Twitter and follow along on Spotify and all of those platforms. We thank everybody for listening to the podcast, and hope to talk to you here again real soon about some more bicycling or maybe some news, blues, and interviews, but all of it from the Heartland and all of it from a podcast by George.